If you've been following this channel, you'll know that we've regularly observed how individuals from Israel, or those representing its perspective, often tend to shift blame onto others, rarely acknowledging any missteps by Israel itself. In this segment, we'll watch as Lucius Goodall challenges an Israeli academic who soon becomes quite agitated, frequently interrupting him and nearly shouting in frustration. Let's dive into the clip, and I'll share my insights at the end.
I think it's part of a lack of understanding, including in Israel, that anti-Semitism has one definition, whether it comes from the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islamist, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. The result of a very long democratic process that was adopted by more than 40 countries, including the UK, across institutions and many of the universities in the UK, enables to identify and combat anti-Semitism for precisely what it is, which is the predictor of extremism, as I said, no matter where it comes from. And that is, in fact, in many, many ways, what's been the hindrance across spaces and places in comprehensively identifying and combating and actually being able to even identify what has become the normalized mainstream strain of anti-Semitism that is ravaging democracies around the world, including in the UK, including with the murder of two people, Jews, praying on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar on Yom Kippur in Manchester, then leading to protests essentially in support of their murderers.
Well, I think everybody, the people involved, we're going to be speaking to one of those people in a moment, Michelle, but the people who've been turning up to these protests, they would deny vehemently the idea that they are turning up in support of that murder. They are saying that they are protesting against Israel's actions, which have been called genocidal by the United Nations in Gaza.
Let's be very clear. Genocide has a definition. The fact that the United Nations and its agencies and institutions, and I'm going to say the human rights infrastructure.
Yes, Michelle, but just yes, I know that. But you accuse those people of supporting that murder. On what basis do you say that?
Please allow me to respond. Genocide has a definition. And in very, very many places, including the UK, those people who think they're showing up in support of what is dubbed pro-Palestinian, if they were pro-Palestinian protests, they would be protesting to free Gaza from Hamas, a prescribed terror organization for whom human tragedy is the strategy.
They're protesting against the thousands of deaths that we've seen, including children in Gaza. That's what they're protesting against, and you don't get to choose, you don't get to decide what people protest about.
That is the strategy. Look, I came on today to make very clear that those protests are in fact enabling the continued war in Gaza, the continued holding.
So it's the protesters' fault that Netanyahu keeps the war going.
Please allow me to finish a sentence. The continued holding of 48 human beings abducted on October the 7th, when more than 1,200 people were burned alive and butchered and raped, and more than 250 were abducted into that same Gaza.
So sorry, Michelle. Sorry, let me just get this straight. Let me just get this straight.
Terror organization that uses the children of Gaza and the people of Gaza as human shields.
So let me just get this straight. Sure, you're saying that the reason that those poor souls, the hostages, are still being detained, or one of the reasons, is because people turn out week after week on the streets of Britain to protest what they see as the inhumane, disproportionate, outrageous response of the Israeli government to civilians in Gaza. You're saying that it's their fault, and it's not Netanyahu. No, let me finish the question. And it's not Netanyahu's fault who chooses to continue to prosecute this war. We should blame those people turning up on the streets of Britain, should we?
Israel has been embroiled in what is a 2-year-long war that began on October the 7th, launching thousands of rockets,
yes, no one denies that.
Not just by Hamas, but by Hezbollah, by the Houthis, by Iran itself, the criminal Islamic regime in Iran. So if people in London truly care about human rights, they would be not just protesting to free Gaza from Hamas, but to free Lebanon from Hezbollah, to free Yemen from the Houthis,
to choose what they care,
Iran from the genocidal Islamic Republic. Instead, what they are doing is actually
in order to protest about something,
Israel, a fellow democracy.
So Michelle, your view is
defending itself from the same genocidal terror and tyranny that endangers the UK.
So your view is that to protest about anything, you have to protest about everything.
Absolutely not, and God forbid.
Right, okay. Well, then no one would ever protest about anything.
That's actually precisely what's happening on the streets of London. What has happened over the last 2 years is the emboldening of genocidal terror proxies of an Islamic criminal regime in Iran.
What role do you think the Israeli government might have had in that, Michelle? Anything at all?
You're not letting me finish one sentence, and I doubt that anybody can understand anything we're saying in this way. Please allow me to finish a sentence so at least your listeners can doubt a little bit of what it is that's happening on the streets. And I don't doubt the good intent of the majority of the people that are showing up on the streets, actually believing that what they're fighting for is human rights. But what they are emboldening is the same genocidal terror and tyranny that Churchill warned Chamberlain that when given the choice between dishonor and war, when you choose dishonor, you will have war. We are embroiled and on the front lines of, that is the state of Israel, a war of barbarism on our civilization.
So will you welcome? So do you think Israel should welcome Tommy Robinson?
It has nothing to do with Tommy Robinson, and this interview for me has nothing at all to do with what it is that you began with. Tommy Robinson and many others have to utilize the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism to identify the anti-Semitism in their own backyard, if you will, if they're actually committed to combating anti-Semitism. That is the test, because as I said, it's interesting how the far or extreme right, the far or extreme left, the far or extreme Islamists intersect at that ever-mutating, lethal, viral hate that is anti-Semitism, that the IRA definition actually enables to identify all strains.
One final thing, Michelle.
Whether they are the traditional strains or the new strain, modern strain, just the anti-Zionist strain that has systematically and for decades demonized, delegitimized, and applied double standards to the state of Israel, the Jew among nations.
One final thing, Michelle. One final thing, Michelle. You say you don't doubt the intentions. I will just note that you began this interview by alleging that people who are turning up to those protests are celebrating and doing so supporting the heinous events that happened in Manchester. That is clearly.
What is it that you think?
I'm just repeating what you said.
The brutal murder of anybody else would actually justify protests that celebrate those murderers.
They didn't celebrate those murders, Michelle. Well, then clearly you're just going back on what you yourself just said when you said you don't doubt the intentions of many of those people, because once again you've alleged without any evidence, as far as I can tell or see, that those people are supporting the murders that we saw in Manchester. So that's completely outrageous. That's completely outrageous. But I just wanted to ask one final question.
Is in fact the
if you wouldn't mind, before shouting.
Because you asked me a question.
No, I didn't ask you a question. I gave the audience a piece of information. I just want to ask you one final question, which is you have been quick to assign blame for the extremism that we're seeing, and indeed for the continuation of the war itself in a way that I don't quite follow, to the people who have been turning up on the streets of Britain week after week in protest as to what's happening in Gaza. What role, if any, do you assign to the Netanyahu government for A, continuing that war and for the hostages not being released, and secondly, for the rising extremism that we're seeing, because many people believe, and many international institutions say, that a genocide is being committed in Gaza, that the response has been disproportionate. So what blame do you think the Israeli government has in this?
Perhaps you'd be able to follow if you allowed me to finish one coherent thought. And worse, perhaps your listeners or viewers would be able to follow if you allow me to finish one coherent sentence. But what I've tried to make accessible to you is that I'm trying to sound the alarms for you in the UK. It is the UK itself and other democracies that have to recognize that it's the UN itself that has enabled its own foundational principles.
Oh, so it's the UN's fault, right? Okay.
You're not letting me finish a sentence again. To be hijacked, redefined, inverted, weaponized, to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the Jew among nations. But as always with anti-Semitism, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews.
Now, I'll hold it there to share my views because I've persistently addressed on this channel the apparent genocide in Gaza and the pattern among Israel's defenders. Have you noticed the consistent pattern when people defend what Netanyahu is doing? It's always someone else's fault. Let me know in the comments if you've observed this trend too. Whenever I check out videos, podcasts, or tweets, it's the same story. Israel pointing fingers at others without taking a step back to say, hey, maybe Netanyahu is going too far. Maybe what's happening with over 66,000 Gazans killed, mostly civilians and kids, is excessive. They never seem to question if it's too much. Instead, there's blame laid on others. In a recent video, a woman named Macau tries to fault UK protesters, claiming they're celebrating the deaths of 2 Jewish people in Manchester. What happened to those individuals was awful and should never occur. Yet, she fails to acknowledge that the genocide in Gaza is ongoing. In a democracy, we have the right to protest what we oppose. This is a basic right, even in Israel, a democratic nation. So shouldn't she understand that? even if she dislikes it. When Tommy Robinson and his group protested recently, despite it being rife with racism from many, they still had the democratic right to do so. People like her, who constantly blame others in discussions about Israel, are completely missing the point. Let's lay down some facts to show Israel's actions in Gaza are beyond excessive. The UN states that Israel has committed 4 of the 5 legally defined genocidal acts in Gaza. Over 66,000 Gazans, mostly civilians, including many children and women, have been killed. More than 90% of Gaza's homes are damaged or destroyed. Essential resources like healthcare, water, and food are mostly cut off, leading to starvation. Attacks on hospitals, aid workers, and journalists are at unprecedented levels. Forced displacement affects nearly all Gazans. UN experts and genocide scholars deem Israeli policies genocidal. Those like her should introspect before giving interviews like this because whatever they claim, our stance is clear. We condemn Hamas, not innocent civilians. Just because Hamas is a terrorist organization doesn't justify the mass killing of civilians as Israel has done. Share your thoughts on this video in the comment section below. I'll provide the full video link there so you can see more. While you're at it, give a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for helping us reach 72,000 subscribers. Let's aim for 80,000. Appreciate your support and see you in the next video.